Hello, my name is Henrike Hahn. I'm a member of the European Parliament for the Greens EFA, and I'm spokeswoman for industrial policy of the German Greens in the European Parliament. And I'm very happy to welcome all the wonderful panelists and viewers to our expert roundtable on raw materials and green transition. And I'm especially happy to welcome Franziska Brandner as well, the voice of raw material of the German government. And I'm very grateful that we can discuss today. So to start with, we need raw materials for green transformation, and that is a fact. So to ensure a sustainable supply of raw materials is one of the central foundations for a European sustainable economy. And raw materials are important for an exit of fossil technologies and the transformation to greenhouse gas neutral technologies, meeting our Paris climate goals. However, we have first to ask how we can achieve a stable supply of raw materials in a sustainable way and in an environmentally and citizen-friendly way. And we have second to ask how we can lower our future demand of raw materials, focusing on technological innovation, material efficiency, substitution, and circular economy. And the German Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action cites it. The International Energy Agency estimates that the demand for critical raw materials needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement will increase by 7 times between 2020 and 2040 for rare earth and by as much as 40 times for lithium. Similar forecasts are also made by the German Raw Materials Agency for the increase in global raw materials extraction. And in the extraction and above all the processing of metals, the European Union is currently very dependent on individual countries, and the extraction of critical raw materials is also highly geographically concentrated. More than 80% of rare earth are mined in China, for example, and South Africa and Russia have a dominant position in the mining of platinum and palladium with a market share of around 80%. China in particular has established itself in recent decades as the most important producer on the world market. And here we reach the question of global competition, of course, and achieving European strategic autonomy. So these are only few of the issues I would like us to raise today. It's a fascinating and a very complex topic. But without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our wonderful moderator today, Mrs. Silke Wettach. And Silke Wettach is EU correspondent in Brussels for the Wirtschaftswoche since 2002, and she's a real expert with numerous topics like critical raw materials, the Inflation Reduction Act, and industrial policy. So I'm very happy to give you the floor, dear Silke Wettach, and I'm looking forward to our discussion and our webinar. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and also a very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us today to this very timely debate. I think there's hardly a proposal by the EU Commission that's so eagerly awaited as the Critical Raw Materials Act. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen first mentioned it last September. We haven't seen any leaks so far. We haven't seen any drafts, but hopefully this discussion this afternoon will give us a flavor of where we're headed, what the real hot topics around critical raw materials are, and how Europe can ensure to be a big player in the green transition. Before we start the discussion, I would like to remind you of a couple of housekeeping rules. First of all, there's going to be interpretation from English into German and vice versa. You just have to click on the globe symbol on your screen. The webinar will be recorded and then posted on the YouTube channel of the European Greens, the Europagruppe Grüne. You won't be recorded, so don't worry. And then also a very important point, there is a chat box for technical support should there be any problems whatsoever. And of course, I would very much encourage you to ask questions, and you can do that by clicking on the question and answer button. Depending on your language setting, it could be FNA. And there you have also a possibility to comment and rate previous questions. So we're hoping for lots of interaction because it just makes a webinar so much more interesting. Let me introduce our panelists. We've got a great panel of experts, and I'm particularly delighted to welcome Franziska Brandner in Berlin.
Hi.
I hope we'll see you. We can't see you at the moment.
No, I'm still working on my internet, but I hope I get it done. But I'm listening and I'm here. So
you're here. We can hear you. That's great. And for all of those who don't know Franziska Brandner, she's the Secretary of State at the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. And she's no stranger to Brussels because she was an MEP from 2009 to 2013. If I remember well, at that time, you had very much an international focus. I mean, you were educated in France and the US, so you have always been a very international creature, dare I say. But it's interesting because I think the international background will help you a lot in your current position. We'll elaborate a bit more on that later on. I'm also delighted to have Peter Handley with us from the European Commission. He's heading the team on energy-intensive industries, raw materials, and hydrogen at the Directorate General for Internal Market. He's done a lot of work related to climate and energy, and also importantly, he's got lots of experience in trade, and I think that's also interesting because he does have also this international perspective that is very important. Hello to Chris Heron from Eurometal, which is Europe's Metal Industry Association. Chris is in charge of the raw materials outreach, and I think in itself it's very interesting that you have a dedicated person for that, because it really implies you need an expert. It's such a crucial issue. And last but not least, in alphabetical order, Michael Reckroth from Berlin and from PowerShift, most importantly. He's done a lot of work on raw materials policy and methods for the energy transition. So we're very much looking forward to your input, Michael Reckroth. Franziska Brandner, let's start with you. What's the German perspective on this? We're all eager to hear from you, the view from Berlin.
Yes, thank you. The view from Berlin is that we are also eagerly awaiting the Raw Material Act. But if I may say so, we have also given input to it. So we have not been just a bystander. And we've even given a German-French input, which I think is also important to highlight, because we said from the beginning that we want this to be a European project and no national competing about raw materials, but really working together. What is important for us is that we need to bring together sustainability and resilience. I think these are the two major goals we need to pursue. Sustainability, when I talk about it, it's on the one sense that we need quite a number of raw materials, minerals, etc., for the green transformation technologies, but also that we need to make the process and the production behind these raw materials much greener and more sustainable in terms of environmental impact, using green energy, etc. So we need to work on this side and making it, depending on the country, more socially just and in much more cooperation with local populations, etc. So that part of setting standards, making sure that we do have not just minerals for the green transformation, but that they are part of the green transformation in terms of environmentally, in much lesser environmental impact, and in using green energy and being transparent about where does the money go, reducing corruption, and working better with local populations. So that's the sustainability part. And we have a responsibility to work there and go into that field, because so far we leave the inputs for the green transformation outside and do not really worry about where they come from. And I think that is not an attitude we can maintain. So, and that, what I just said in terms of sustainability applies for extraction, for refining, and for recycling. And it applies to Germany, the EU, and worldwide. So we also have to look again into what kind of raw materials do we have, how can we use them and thereby prove how environmentally friendly that is possible, refining, and I think that is the technology that we need to really work on and make sure we have the best at use. The second part comes to resilience. When I mean resilience, we have to make sure that we get less dependent on single sourcing, be it in extraction or refining. And that also means that we really have to get serious about circular economy, because it's not acceptable that the materials we already have at home are not used again and again. So for me, of course, circular economy and recycling has an environmental advantage and climate advantage, but it also really has a resilience point because it makes us just less dependent. And we need to be really strict on this. Part of that is not in the Raw Material Act, but on the Eco Design Directive. But I think we really have to make sure that in the Eco Design Directive now, we still get that circular aspect about resources and raw materials in. It's actually interesting, the Italian government, for example, is also pushing for that. And I hope that the Eco Design Directive will take that part into, its life, and not just the energy, but much also on the resource part and the circularity by design and getting that into moving. And on the resilience part as well, I think, when it comes to diversification, we really have to build the green partnerships across the world, and they are only possible to build if we allow for value creation locally. And that value creation locally, of course, needs careful drafting and often has an impact on our trade policies. That's not DG Grow, that's DG Trade, but I think, in the Raw Material Act, we also have that trade part. And my experience is that if we do not bring a package that is clear that this is not about exploitation, but about cooperation in building the green supply chains and value chains of the future, then we're not even a good, partner to even start talking to. So this is for me very important to say, this is a new approach. We really want to make sure that everybody can create wealth in the new green supply chains, and that this is a collaborative project that we have, not just in the EU, but worldwide. That is for me part of the resilience in terms of, creating new partnerships. And that needs then also to have criteria and standards that are key to set internationally. And final point is of, who will finance all of this, the resilience and the sustainability. And there we need to make sure that we do distribute risks carefully. We need to have, we need to ensure that geopolitical risks are counted in by companies. And I hope on the Commission to come up with that in their proposal. You have been talking about stress tests when it comes to specific minerals. We really need to check that we do not, have a phase again where everybody's talking about raw materials, projects are started, and in 2 years' time, when prices are going down, maybe it's a bit more peaceful. Companies are again not investing, and then if something goes wrong, we will all be in a very difficult situation. So I think it's inspiring to see what the Japanese are doing. I'm sure that the Commission has looked at the economic security bill, which has been, passed in May last year. I'm like, we're looking at this and, trying to find the best way And the G7 format is pushing on that as well, the Japanese leadership this year. So I think there needs to be something that we make sure that the interests are really aligned, and that those companies who are diversifying, who are investing in new green supply chains, that they are not outbid by those companies who do not respect that and that take too many risks. So that's that level playing field in terms of resilience and sustainability has to be created, and that needs to be created at the EU level. And I hope that the Commission will put that as in the package as well.
Okay, thank you so much for giving us a flavor of the size of the challenge. I mean, you've mentioned sustainability, you've mentioned resilience. Just by themselves, they'd be quite a big challenge, but we're really faced with something that will require a lot of thought. And I think it's also very interesting that you pointed out that one legislative proposal probably won't be enough, that there needs to be interaction with other proposals, or you mentioned eco-design specifically. So it's quite a huge endeavor. Peter Handley, we've heard you've received German-French input. Have you received input from other countries? And could you give us an idea of what you're up to?
Yes, and it's great to hear Ms. Brantner speak in the way she has, because I didn't hear a single word which causes us a problem. It's all very much in tune with what we're working on. Here, by the way, is zero draft of the regulation. Lot of steps to go between now and adoption day next month, and let's hope it doesn't leak in the meantime, but I can't be overconfident on that. So I'm going to just address 3 points from what Ms. Brantner just said. The first point is very much about circular economy and making sure that we don't overestimate the demand that we need to achieve our political objectives. And here, if I refer to yesterday's conclusions from the European Council, we're encouraged to ensure access to critical raw materials, including by diversifying sourcing and by recycling raw materials to promote circular economy principles. So it's there in black and white from the leaders. I think if I step back from my role as an official and speak more as a European citizen, what I see is that the European region consumes a lot of things. We're a big consuming part of the world, but we don't really fully take our responsibilities for matching how we meet our demand. Basically, we close our eyes and outsource a lot of the supply of these raw materials to the rest of the world, and we don't ask too many questions about how it's done. And I think one of the drivers in our proposed Critical Raw Materials Act is that it's time that Europe stepped up and took more responsibility for balancing its consumption with how it feeds that consumption. So more circularity, building that in by design into products, including through eco-design, as Ms. Brantner was saying, is part of it. But I think also it's about improving the transparency about the way these critical raw material markets work globally. I've seen a few projects being proposed in the last few days where part of the case that companies make when looking for investment is, we have done a life cycle assessment of our project, and we can see that what we're proposing to do would give us a footprint 1/3 of the way it's done today in the country or 1 or 2 countries which supply the world with this material. Okay, I'm not going to name any names, but I think environmental footprint and transparency have a big role to play in helping to encourage downstream manufacturing industries to act more responsibly and look into the benefits of investing in clean processes here in Europe or in the countries where we want to partner with. I think also that innovation, research and innovation into much cleaner ways of exploring, extracting, mining and recycling, less intrusive, less environmentally damaging, can all play their part. Also in finding ways round. I mean, we already see in the world of batteries that if you see a problem with a particular security of supply issue, people are quite inventive and they can work out alternative technologies to get to the same performance objective without actually finding you can't do it because of a lack of a certain critical raw material. Now, that was on the circularity side, and I think you'll find in our proposal that there's a very strong chapter about sustainability, level playing field, and what we want to achieve on the recovery and recycling side. We also, and this is a point I discussed with Ms. Hahn before, we also really want to put the spotlight on all this mining waste and tailings that's lying around Europe from decades, if not centuries of previous mining activity, where stuff is put on the land, on the surface, and it contains lots of critical raw materials that weren't valued before, but they do have a value now. And we'd like to inventorize all this stuff and make this information available so that businesses can seize opportunities to process in sustainable ways these sources of critical raw materials that are on the surface and in mining regions where, you know, the whole culture understands what this is about. Second point about diversifying our supply. Again, I agree very much with what Ms. Brantner was saying. And I think you'll see in our Critical Raw Materials Act that we're actually wanting to offer the rest of the world a new value proposition from the European Union. We get it that countries who have lots of raw materials don't want some third country to come in, dig this stuff up, and ship it off for processing in their home regions. We get it that countries want to develop added value in country. They want to move into processing, refining, producing things. And they want to do it in a sustainable way. And we are going to be proposing ways in which the European Union can help countries achieve these objectives in a mutually beneficial way. And let's not forget that Europe is one of the world leaders in many of the mining technologies. We've got leading companies in several member states which can help with this. The last point is about company responsibility. I've already mentioned it a little bit. So I can say to Ms. Brantner, yes, we are intending to include provisions to encourage companies to take more responsibility for investing in their own resilience, looking beyond the way that today's supply chains operate and trying to assess the risks, bring these risks up to the board level and take appropriate investment and risk mitigation actions. These actions can involve, trying to look for a couple of extra sources of supply rather than depending on a single supplier. They can include developing longer inventories. They can include maybe collaborating with other companies in some kind of club to procure resources and cushion eventual supply chain disruptions. There's a whole range of things. We're not going to be too prescriptive on this. And we think that member state governments have an important role to play in providing the incentivizing framework for these kind of things to happen. But we definitely believe it's time that downstream manufacturers in particular started to invest in more resilient, more sustainable mining, refining and recycling of the critical raw materials that at the end of the day go into making the products that they sell to us, the public, something they can put their hands on their hearts and say, this is a clean and sustainable product. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a great teaser. It's good to know that the proposal is already there in writing. I'm going to move to Chris Heron. You represent the companies that will have to deal with all of this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. Pleasure to be here this afternoon, and thanks MEP Hahn for the invitation to give the collective metals industry view on the Critical Raw Materials Act. And of course, we're excited as well about the announcement next month. And I know we have member companies across the supply chain who really want to do their part to help secure Europe's clean energy manufacturing base based on environmental and social responsibility, as has been mentioned. And personally, I mean, I've worked on this for 8 years on raw materials topics, and it is a really challenging part of the energy transition. And it's encouraging also to see that we're now having this really in-depth debate about the trade-offs and the needs that Europe has without maybe shying away, as Francisca mentioned earlier. For us as the metals industry, I'd say 3 key requests or hopes for the Critical Raw Materials Act. Number one, that it helps to drive forward responsible investments in the mining, refining and recycling stage, building on the potential that Europe has. Number two, on the global side, that it really prioritizes the partners that can deliver the materials we need by 2030. And as has been mentioned previously, that it offers a new value proposition founded on ESG principles in these regions. And then number three, really take action to establish Europe as the world's recycling leader, and maybe not be naive here. There's a lot of parts of the world that want our waste. So let's act now to make sure we're set up for when it becomes available. A lot of what Francisca and Peter have already mentioned in terms of the how, we'd fully endorse, especially the new diplomacy. And I noted cooperation, not exploitation, as a way to go forwards for Europe, which the industry and the companies that Europe has wants to be part of. There was a great example I saw last week or 2 weeks ago where Germany went to Chile, formed partnerships. One of our member companies, Arubis, partnered with a Chilean company around a sustainable copper value chain, and hopefully that's an example that continue forward. Just on those 3 points, though, in terms of how we drive domestic investment forwards, firstly, we think it's good to set a direction of travel for 2030 about where Europe should be in terms of its domestic potential. Looking at the project pipeline, we think it's feasible that Europe aims to meet around 25% of its mining needs from domestic sources for each material at minimum, where the geology is allowing. And at the refining stage, to be a bit more ambitious, maybe 50% of its needs from domestic refineries. The lead times are lower. We're not dependent on geology here. And this is an area where we can help to break the dependence on China. We have projects there to drive forwards, 3 enabling conditions needed to make sure that they can get forwards, permits, financing, and frameworks. Already mentioned a bit, but hopefully the Critical Raw Materials Act can help us to reduce the permitting times. They're very long in Europe currently, and to do so in a way that's tackling the unnecessary bureaucracy that's happening across each stage without removing the environmental safeguards which need to be in place. For finance, there's a lot we could learn from the US Inflation Reduction Act, which is quite bold in how it's financing raw materials projects in the US, but looking at more attractive CapEx support for projects here in Europe, and also things like tax breaks to help with the high operating expenditure for European projects. And lastly, most importantly, the frameworks. If you're a company looking to invest in Europe currently, it's sometimes a difficult place. We have very high energy prices today. Metals production is an energy intensive process, and that's a very difficult situation for some companies. And also predictability in terms of the regulation that will be in place for the next decade when those investments are needed. If we can deliver on those 3 points, then we do have a chance of bringing some of those projects forwards, and hopefully we can do so in a way which is also working for the communities. On the second point, the global point, a lot has been mentioned from Francisco and Peter on the new diplomacy for the European Commission. I would just add from an industry perspective, we'd really like to prioritize the countries that are going to be able to deliver the raw materials by 2030 when the bottlenecks will be highest. Because mines have lead times of 10 to 15 years, we already know what mines will be open by 2030 and what will be a much longer term perspective. So for example, Latin America for copper and for lithium, Indonesia will be a hotspot for nickel, for cobalt, the Democratic Republic of Congo for cobalt too. These are going to be the resource-rich powerhouses of the next decade. And this is where it might be challenging for Europe to have that value proposition because China has a large foothold in some of these regions already. So how do we act boldly and differentiate ourselves from the maybe more exploitative model that's built up there? And then lastly, on the recycling side, just quickly, we're going to have a lot of scrap coming after 2040. That's when recycling will really be a big benefit to the European economy from batteries, from magnets and more. We think it can be our key driver for strategic autonomy as Europe in that long-term perspective. But today, other parts of the world really want access to that waste too. Speaking about China, South Korea, all looking to build their own recycling industries. So hopefully we can set a framework which is keeping waste in the recycling loop here in Europe, looking at things like the transport rules, standards to make sure that people recovering batteries or electronics waste are equipped to recover the materials safely, and other ways that the regulation can help to drive that forward. So just to conclude, 3 things: investment for the permits finance framework, prioritizing those countries that we need to form partnerships with, and making sure we're equipped and ready for our waste to come after 2040. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lots of points we hopefully will be coming back to. And I got the order wrong. I got the alphabet wrong. It's Henrike's Haan, the hostess's turn. Now, we've heard that the Commission is planning a very comprehensive approach. You'll have to deal with it in the European Parliament. Is it encouraging what we've been hearing from Peter Hanley?
Yes, thank you very much. Of course, I mean, I appreciate every single remark in the discussion, and we look in the same direction, that's for sure. But on the other hand, we will also look in the details. That's very clear as well. And they are very important because we know raw materials are essential to the shift to a climate neutral society. And I expect from the upcoming Critical Raw Materials Act in the upcoming proposal to promote a green vision for raw materials use and reuse in coherence with environmental, social, trade, industrial, energy, and climate priorities. And of course, we need the highest possible standards for that. And for us, it will be important to mitigate the EU dependency of raw materials and to increase its resilience and strategic autonomy, of course. And at the same time, we also want to reduce the supply risk and to foster the achievement of the European climate and environmental goals. And in the upcoming EU legislative framework dedicated to raw materials, we should consider some points I would like to outline. So first of all, when we consider access to strategic materials as an overriding public interest or quicker permitting times, as Mr. Chris Heron just mentioned, this should not lead to any sort of exemption or derogation exploiting the loopholes of the existing EU environmental acquis. And I mentioned that because we had that discussion recently in the CHIPS Act, and we found a wonderful solution for that, I think. So we could somehow think about it if we could use that as a solution in the future for other files as well. And then second, we have to develop science-based and robust specifications leveraging EU R&I programs, as Mr. Peter Handley had mentioned before as well, for the highest environmental and social standards of mining activities to be applied in the EU as well as in trade relationships. And third, I think the selection of European strategic projects have to grant priority to close the loop of materials over other segments of the value chain. And as a fourth point, I think we should promote substitution of materials. We should favor exploration and reprocessing of mine waste over new mines and apply the excavation last principle. And instead of a blind calling for more mining in Europe, as we discussed when we worked on that in ITRE already, we need to specify the concrete demand of raw material, and we should also think of sustainable long-term strategies. So we have to develop substitution strategies to mitigate the pressure on a limited number of materials and the risk of exacerbation scarcities. And it can be a material substitution, for instance, replacing copper by aluminum in cables and wires, or platinum by palladium in hydrogen technologies. Or we can have a technological substitution, for example, for instance, in the case of PV panels, wind turbines, or battery technologies. Or we can think of functional substitution, for example, for instance, developing renewable-based hydrogen technologies alongside batteries for energy storage applications. So we know that circular economy is key. Franziska Brandner mentioned that at the very beginning as well. And moving to a circular economy is urgent and represents a significant potential of reduction of materials from primary sources. And it starts by reducing demand via efficiency and sufficiency to avoid extraction of materials. We also know innovation is key too, continuation and expansion of research and development with the aim of bringing new technologies in a timely manner and to incorporate the knowledge gained to be incorporated into teaching and learning. And at the expected lifetime of metals in the economy varies between just a few months to more than a century. For metals like iron and aluminium used in construction, we must prioritize the extension of the expected lifetime and materials. And we can do that by reusing, repairing, refurbishing, all these kind of things we all know, and by recycling materials, of course. And it would be good to close the loop of strategic materials in the European Union and impose recycled content in final products that could create a competitive edge and contribute to reshore manufacturing capacities of key technologies. And of course, it would be good as well to close the loop via recycling. That should be fostered as well by a priority granted to secondary raw materials as long as market dynamics are unable to do so. And this we should do to facilitate the emergence of an entire industrial ecosystem relying on secondary raw materials. And when it comes to improving the recovery of materials, given the significant number of old mines in Europe, we must invest in mapping material content of most resource-rich waste streams like tailings to further identify the most valuable ones that might be reprocessed without causing excessive impacts on the environment. For instance, a database reporting the volumes and types of extractive waste deposits, providing the mineral exploited and waste types, should be established. And when we talk about global cooperation, because it was mentioned before as well in that discussion, for the sake of global justice and coherence in development policy, the EU must work alongside its partners in low-income countries. Instead, the EU must aim at negotiating with its partners to develop sustainable trade and cooperation agreements that uphold the right of each party to regulate and to create added value for both parties and ensure a high level of sustainable development, climate, and human rights protection. So I think the EU has to show leadership by supporting its partners, in particular in low-income countries, in finding the necessary investments to ensure that raw material supply chains become as exemplary as possible with regard to environment, workers, and human rights. And I think Mr. Michael Reckert will talk about that as well very soon. And as a last point, the Raw Materials Club that Franziska Wanda mentioned before, recently announced by the Commission, could become, I think, a valid alliance to diversify sourcing, but also a key driver to develop multilateral solutions towards a global regulatory alignment on highest environmental, social, and human rights standards. So actually, there is a lot we can do for sustainable mining and to find long-term solutions, no more to be dependent on raw materials. And in the long term, a circular economy must be the target for all raw material EU policy. But the good message is, I think there is a lot we can do about that, and we can find political solutions in the future. So I'm really looking forward to the draft of the Commission on raw materials very soon. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I can tell you're eager to work on it. Mr. Henrico, earlier we've heard we all have been pretty careless. We sort of closed our eyes. We didn't care too much about where these critical raw materials came from, under which conditions they were being mined. We all like our mobile phones, but we don't really put a lot of thought about what kind of misery might behind that. What do you expect from the Raw Materials Act?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'll try to share my screen because I think Friday afternoon, maybe someone is happy to see some slides. Let me have two general remarks before starting. The first thing is we often talk about the demand of the renewables, and we had this data from the Luxembourg Institute for Science and Technology, and this shows it's not renewable energy production, but it's electricity production in general. This is metal intensive, and this is also for coal, because we also would have a need to renew our coal infrastructure if we want to stay with that. Hopefully not, hopefully we'll phase out soon. But anyway, so it's electricity production. So we sometimes should also think about debating about how to reduce our electricity consumption, and have a second look, who are the key driver for the demand. And I remember the presentation from Eurometaux and KU Leuven, where Ms. Gregoros said that 60% of the demand is going to the mobility sector. So I think we also have to talk about the mobility sector as a key driver for the demand, much more than renewables. This is the first remark. The second one is when we talk about the future demands, we often lack to have a look back in the history. And this is data until 2013. From 2013 to 2032, 23 is just we reached a plateau. But anyway, over the last 25 years, we have a dramatic increase of mining and metal production all over the world. And this has several reasons. One reason is China, India, and some other countries are also developing, and that's good. And on the other side, we should not forget that we have a global injustice if it comes to metal consumption. And 25 to 30% of all metals are consumed here in the EU, and we only have 6% of the population. So I think we should have this in mind. And this is a little bit the background for the 5 remarks or the 5 hopes I have for the Critical Raw Materials Act. And I think a lot of was already mentioned, which makes me happy. But the first point, our main point, was not very clear named yet. I think we need targets to reduce raw materials use, especially primary raw materials use in absolute figures. And I think the EU Parliament are often called the EU Commission to have science-based binding EU midterm and long-term targets for this reduction. And I think we need this debate because without reducing our high demand, I think we will not have resiliency. We will stay dependent from China, from Russia, and their partner countries like Myanmar and others. So I think this is something we expect in the debate much more. We need targets to reduce our metal footprints. That's the first thing. The second thing was mentioned, and well, we see a lot of development with the German government and also with the debate in the EU, and we're really looking forward to the final version of the EU battery directive. But anyway, we have to secure strong human rights obligations in mining. There's so many different violations mining companies. Well, as being a member of several email lists from NGOs, I think nearly every week there's a report of a human rights violation somewhere in the world in the mining sector. I think Global Witness has this reports once a year about the environmental defenders, and the mining sector is often most deadly sector for environmental defenders. And therefore, the EU should make a strong commitment to and enforcement of mandatory human rights and environment due diligence. Maybe with a reference to the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. I think there's a lot of development in the moment, but we need this strong obligations to be trustworthy partner for other countries and especially people on the ground. And the battery regulation was often mentioned as a blueprint. This might be a good blueprint also for other regulations and other products. The third thing is, Henrike Hahn mentioned that also, the guarantee of strong environmental standards, and I would like to add the local participation. We have a lot of challenges for democratic countries, and democracy is in a lot of countries all over the world, also inside of Europe, under threat. And I think local participation helps to get a social license to operate. Therefore, we sometimes hear from politicians and also from industry associations about this NIMBY, not in my backyard protest. I liked what the guy from Rio Tinto said in the Raw Materials Week in Brussels last year. He said, well, we don't know any NIMBY projects. We take every protest serious. And I think this is important. If you see the map, this is an environmental justice atlas, and every orange dot is a conflict around mining. Could be a question of unfair compensation. It could be a killing of an activist. So it's a quite huge range of a conflict. But anyway, we see with any plans to streamline and quicker permitting procedures, it should be focused on strengthening and improving administrative capacities and not on bypassing environmental standards or safeguards. I think this is a very important principle, and I think this is something local communities will observe very closely. The fourth thing is to stop the environmental destruction. We heard already that there might be priority projects, mining projects, but all the criteria should be chosen based on a robust assessment of environmental and social risks, and that there is a full consent of the local communities. And we also see, I think we had this biodiversity reports every day, 160 species or animals and plants are fearing extinction. I think while we have this webinar, 10 species we are losing in this time. We have to define no-go zones, and this might be protected areas, Natura 2000 sites, the Arctic and the deep sea, to stop this biodiversity loss and losing these places. And this also means include environmental and climate due diligence in the due diligence standards. Fifth and last point, we cannot mine our way out of the crisis. I think to information, the mining and the production of metals, smelting, refining, is accounting for around 10 to 15% of the global CO2 emissions. We see also the trend to green steel, or well, less fossil fuel depending steel. But anyway, mining has an impact on the climate crisis, and approximately 7% of deforestation is due to mining, maybe even more. And we also see that very often companies that seem to be the solution for metal mines are also investing into coal, gas, and oil. So we see this connection. Therefore, we asked that any objections must favor the use of secondary over primary raw materials, and especially there in the fields where investments are done, ensure that at least 30% of all investments are on secondary sourcing and projects. And this also means, like Enrique Hahn mentioned, remining old mining sites or invest into recycling plants. This also means that we need to set the design requirements for products containing critical raw materials, ensure product longevity, ability to disassemble, repair, and replacement information and requirements are crucial. And also we have it with the battery regulation that we include minimum content of recycled critical raw materials in relevant products, like the battery in the batteries for mobility. And maybe as a conclusion and as a last point, I think acting on climate change is very, very urgent. But in the same time, it's not a contradiction in reducing primary metals use. And I think we talk a lot of resilience, and I think with our high dependency from China, Russia, and other countries, we have to tackle our demand also, and not only to secure the supply. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You made a couple of very relevant points, but there's one point I'd like to pass on directly to Franziska Brandner, because what you said, Michael Record, was we need targets for reduction. We've seen that in the context of energy. Reducing demand is something that's not very popular, and politicians are reluctant to ask for that. So I would like to ask you, do you think that is a good approach? And I would link it in with another question is, do you think it would make sense for the RMA to contain specific targets for self-sufficiency? You know, in both cases, we would be talking about specific targets. To what extent is it necessary actually to force consumers and producers to behave in a certain way, and maybe also politicians, because self-sufficiency is something that will require some political input. So is it useful to work with targets?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. You know, I think if we are serious about reducing our demand, we have to be really precise in terms of what materials we're talking about in what kind of timeframes. And yes, of course, the raw material demand is not just for solar panels and wind, it's for our mobile phones, it's for everywhere we use electricity, digitalization. So yes, but what we will see in the renewable energy field is that we will hopefully see an increase of that energy. So we will see an increase of the raw materials needed for that. So if we now say we will want to use less of that over the next 10 years, and if we're serious about in terms of not just you produce it less here, but we import it less, it means we do have less PV and less wind. So I would not be in accordance with that. But if we talk about other material where we clearly can be more efficient and reduce the amount we need, then yes, I'm all in favor of it. So I think, an abstract answer in terms of for all minerals, for all elements, we make a reduction target of whatever, I think would not be very helpful. So, one has to be more precise. And then I think one can also set, innovation and efficiency standards. And I think that's what I spoke about in the Eco Design Directive, because there we have efficiencies, energy in there. And I think we need to be much more careful about resource efficiency, about using less and more in a circular way, but also efficiency. And I think there, Mr. Reckert is very right when he says we need to talk also about resource efficiency, not just energy efficiency. And that this becomes part of our strategy. I give you one example. When you build electrolyzers, there are different ways of doing it. Some of them are more resource, need more resources, raw materials. Others need less. So if you will start subsidizing the production of electrolyzers, why don't you put from the beginning a criteria of resource efficiency? That you only support those financially that from the beginning have a front runner approach to resource efficiency. So I think, this one, the question of resource, not just energy efficiency, we really need to streamline that into all our funding projects, be it solar, be it wind, be it electrolyzers, be it the grid, be it, digital, and have that part of it. So I think, it should be there as a general line in the Raw Material Act, the concept of resource efficiency and resource saving. But I'm not going to be a person to say we will need less lithium in the next 10 years. It's just not realistic. Or we will import it and don't care where it comes from, which I think is the worst. And then I hope, as I think Henrike was saying, that we need a lot of research to go into innovation and substitution, to really also find out which ones can we replace, and also innovation for efficiency. So I think that's also part of what we aim to do in Germany, is to have more of that. And I know the Commissioner, Gabriela, is already doing a lot on that, that she's planning to do more research in this area, Maria Gabriel. So I think that, that is very welcome. And if I may give one example on the, making it cleaner, and you mentioned that, Chris, on the Chile example, because, I don't want to say I'm proud of it, but I'm a bit, of being able to say we do broker a deal between a state-owned company, Codelco, which runs really terrible copper smelters, which are still of the quality of 30 years ago, and the environmental impact is really high. And to say, okay, we bring our German technology from our Rubis, which is amazing. They have a smelter in the middle of Hamburg and you can't notice, and bring that technology to Chile. And in return, we have cooperation on copper. And then we added recycling, that we helped them build up the copper recycling process. So that entire deal, and we as a government, facilitated, put in also, then the funding, investment guarantees, etc. And the Chilean government is supporting Codelco and wants that to happen from Codelco. So we have, for us, resource efficient, like resource access. We help the environmental side, and we create also a local circular economy. For me, that's sort of the type of partnerships we really need to build. And from which we can all benefit. And the Chileans are very happy about it because they want to keep the smelting part. They do not just want extraction, but they cannot afford and do not have the technology inside Chile to make that possible. So for them, the option was just to close them all down and only extract and send it to China and have the smelters there. So, I think that's the way forward, and we have to be very practical and be sure that we support
holistic approaches. And self-sufficiency, like specific targets?
I think, again, you have to be careful in terms of which sector, which material, and what years, what timeframes. I think, Europe, we know by our geography on some of the substances, we will never be self-sufficient. On others, we can. But that means that we have to use much more of our own resources. And, I think I give you one example, gallium. Yeah, gallium is very important for the creation of wafers, or for some part of the wafers, which none of our mobile phones would work without. We used to have a gallium production in Germany until 2015, quite significant. And that one was not closed down because of environmental protests or considerations, or local people didn't like it, but because it was not competitive compared to Chinese imports, which were so cheap that they just had to close down. So if we at the European level will set standards and put responsibility tasks that these production sites become profitable again. They will never be as cheap as the Chinese. We in Germany, we don't have forced labor. So we will need to make sure that there is a level playing field for these production sites to be competitive. But why import it from a much less environmentally friendly production site instead of having that in Germany? So I think we can do much more to be self-sufficient and go into the circular, as I said earlier, the circular economy has to be a large one, but we also have to be honest and fair again about what we can also provide ourselves. And for that, it needs to be competitive, and we need to set a framework that allows our domestic production to be competitive. And I think that will only work at the European level. I can't do it on a German level.
Enrique Hahn, you could do it. You're working on the European level. What are your thoughts on a specific target for self-sufficiency? Or targets, I should rather say.
Thank you very much for this interesting question, of course, because we had the discussion in the CHIPS Act as well, where the Commission provided a share of 20% of global manufacturing as a goal to become less dependent on other countries. And of course, well, I think it's a political goal, right? You can set, but it's not necessarily realistic. So I think rather, instead of specifying a target that might be a little arbitrary, we should think about other examples or other measures. For example, how much lithium is needed to continue battery production in Europe during a crisis, for example, or a supply shock, which may last a couple of months, for example. So these kind of informations could then be translated into a target. I think that would be a very specific solution we could use for, and even if there's a win to insist on political targets, maybe there's a loss if we can't meet them. So I think a realistic approach would be better on that.
Can I add something? Sorry.
Sure.
I really think that we should stop making policies only via setting targets. I really want to speak about instruments and about how to get there. Mm-hmm. I think we have set enough targets and climate targets, and then we make them even tougher year by year. And I think, what is important is to focus on the instruments we're getting there, and to make sure that they're streamlined in all the other parts.
Trying to figure out whether Peter Hanley is still with us, because I saw him leave earlier. Is he still around? No, I think he probably left. I'm
still here. I'm still here.
Sorry, I just saw. Great. So targets. Will you set targets? Is there anything you could share with us at this point in time? How do you feel about targets in the European Commission?
My commissioner has been speaking in public about the need to have something you can measure. And he's been talking about the aim being to rebalance a little bit. It's about the European Union taking more responsibility and also increasing its leverage globally. So he's not saying we go from 0 to 100% self-sufficiency. That's not possible, and it's not desirable. But we should get up to a reasonable level of covering our own needs, it gives us more leverage when we're negotiating with other parts of the world, right? And also it's a way of cushioning ourselves against supply chain disruption. So he's probably talked about we should be aiming, if you give one number, 25 to 30% self-sufficiency by a given date. Now, I would be the first to say that's a political declaration rather than a regulatory implementable target. But we are looking at what kind of targets might make sense. And I do hear also that on the other side, many parliamentarians and politicians would like to have ambitious targets for recycling. So, you know, I think we're still examining the question of self-sufficiency and whether it makes sense to set targets in addition to the instruments that we are developing. But I'd also like to piggyback on what Dr. Brantner said about the project in Chile with Arubis. It's absolutely the kind of thing we want to be doing through the Critical Raw Materials Act. We've already got another example of this. The Finns are developing a very similar smelting
in Mexico.
project in Mexico.
I know, that's an excellent one.
We've just put forward in the Mineral Security Partnership to kind of, if you like, crowdfund this. It's very much about clean technologies for primary and using recycled, recovered copper. So it's the primary and secondary, clean process, low footprint. And what's more, it means the Latin American extracted copper doesn't just get shipped off to China, right? So the more we can develop a multipolar approach to processing and refining in a sustainable way, the more we enhance the global resilience. And what's missing is the readiness of European companies to do exactly the same kind of thing in Africa. That's what we need to work on next.
Chris Heron, that's where you can come in. And I was also wondering how you feel about specific targets. Where might they make sense, or don't they make sense at all?
I mentioned earlier, we think there's a value indeed of setting a goal for where we want to be by 2030. One goal for the mining stage, a higher goal at the processing and refining stage, because we can do more there, and something at the recycling stage to look at the capacity that's built up, plus maybe something to do with diversification. How that's delivered, I guess, will be the political decision that is happening. But I think a reason why we think it's beneficial is because we want to ensure a lifetime of the Critical Raw Materials Act also beyond its publication. And it was mentioned, I think, Francisca, that the whole package of legislation surrounding these sectors needs to be pushing into the same direction. And so far, we don't necessarily have that direction of travel, this clear aim for where it wants to go, that in the next European Commission and beyond, we can feed into the policy that gets developed. We've seen a few other raw material strategies in the past, which haven't necessarily changed the situation. And maybe if we do have that clear idea of where we want to go, we can ensure those other regulations are heading in that direction. And also to pick up the point that some of these industries are hard to build or at risk of being lost. We mentioned the example of gallium, and there are several examples of industries that Europe has and lost for various reasons. Some maybe the environmental footprint, like rare earths. We prefer that was produced in China. But our magnesium industry was competitive until, again, Chinese dumping forced it out of operation 2 decades ago. Our aluminium sector today is very under pressure for the same reasons. In 2022, we produced a third of the aluminium that we were producing in 2007 to do with the energy crisis and other points. So there is a risk that we lose some of the capacity we have, as well as not succeed in growing it. So I think somehow crucial that we look at how we can put all of that going in the same direction. And sometimes there is a cost premium. So for producing rare earths here in Europe, I saw an estimate is 20 to 30% more expensive than the Chinese alternative. And that's very tricky then to deliver the support measures, the trade safeguards that are going to keep those operations competitive and successful. And that's maybe where a clear political goal and direction is going to be helpful to say, no, we need to do this to support and safeguard this industry as it scales up. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael Reckert. Which of the pillars do you think will be most crucial to achieve the EU's objectives for 2030 and 2050? Could you give us an idea of that?
Well, what targets for self-sufficiency or? Oh,
in general, which parts of the RMA do you think are the most important ones to actually reach the climate goals then?
The climate goals.
I'm getting ahead.
I totally agree that the targets in building new renewables should be not under threat, and therefore, yes, we need metals and minerals. But I also agree on that we need targets and instruments and political measures. So we really have to say in the end, are the instruments working? So we need numbers, targets, etc. But I think we need to have a closer look. What are the driver of the demand? In our research, it's very often the mobility sector and the construction sector. So how can we change these sectors? What political steps, what kind of legislations, what kind of instruments do we have to reduce their demand? And to reach the climate goals, I think we need on a lot of levels progress. And one progress is the circular economy, because if we see the CO2 emissions of recycled material, it's much lower than with primary raw materials. If we see it with bauxite, aluminium, or iron ore, or copper, or else. So I think this is why we ask for a minimum 30% of the finances are going into this sector. And of course, we also know this means building also smelters and refiners to secure the circular economy here in Europe. And in the same time, I think, this will be crucial. And for us, I think this is the crucial point.
Franziska Brandner, how do we make sure that we actually focus on the right materials, the ones that really matter strategically?
Yeah, I think, there are several lists. We have in Germany, we have a raw material agency, which has developed a list. The European Commission will come up with a new one, but basically, it's the ones you need, the ones that you don't have so many times, that are difficult to substitute, and where it's difficult to, even if they are geographically not just very limited, but the exploitation level so far is limited and you cannot drive it up fast. That also comes in. So sometimes you have materials when you don't even have to substitute them, but the same one can be smelted very fast, or can be imported from another country very fast. So then you don't have to be so tough on them. So it's a number of criteria you have to look at. And I think, we have to look at them all, and they need to be dynamic. So it's not a final list, forever, but it's a list we define today. And maybe tomorrow we don't need so much lithium because the batteries will be based on, silicium and others we don't even know yet. So I think
moving target.
It will be moving target, and I think that's right. And I also think in terms of a recycling part of that, the more we get into urban mining, some of them might become less critical than when we have a circular. Then we can take them off the list. So there are a number of criteria, and we have to constantly check. And then we need to prioritize also the areas which are really vital for our economies. Health, energy, defense. And I think these are the areas that we need to check that we have the access. And so that I've heard that the European list will come out soon again. And we have in Germany, we really have a lot of expertise in our raw material agency, I must say. It's quite a good one. And they know, and as Mr. Heron said, you know exactly today what kind of amount of minerals you will have in 5 years, because if they're not yet in the pipeline, they won't be there. I'm like, even if you discover them now in Sweden, they will be used in like 10 years earliest. So the raw material, it's like you need to have a long-term vision, and I think that's what we need to make sure that we don't lose that picture, because in my ministry they have been doing raw material strategies like every 10 years. Whenever the prices go up, they make a raw material strategy, then companies start thinking about investing, then prices go down or dumping comes in, then they go off again, and then 10 years later you realize, oh my god, it's difficult. And those countries that have a real advantage, like Japan and South Korea, they don't go into those, we call them Schweinezyklen, like swine circles. And I want to add, because we as a ministry, we have ordered a study to see, because often the argument comes, it will be more expensive. And I thought it was so interesting because we asked them the question over 30, 40 years to compare the raw material prices for companies in countries whose government have no active raw material policy compared to those companies in regions and countries that have an active raw material policy, like Japan and South Korea for many, many years and decades. And de facto, on average, the cost of raw materials for companies is lower in countries that have an active raw material policy. And Europe, the entire EU, has no active raw material policy so far, and we have the highest raw material prices. So I think, there's even an economic argument if you look not just at the next 2-3 years, but if you look at the next 10, 20, 30 years, it's cheaper for companies as well. So,
very good point. And I think there's just some strategic thinking that's being needed, and it's probably Japan you mentioned earlier. That's a good example. So Peter, tell us.
Korea is the same. Like, I can only recommend that study. It's on our webpage because it really counters the narrative that this will just be so much more expensive for all our companies. It's really the opposite if you look at the a medium-term perspective.
So Peter, tell us what's happening at the European level in terms of lists and forward thinking.
Yeah. So we are doing our analysis with the best agencies around Europe. That includes DERA in Germany, BRGM in France, the Finnish, and there's a real lot of knowledge around Europe. And I think what we're going to do this March is we're going to propose a refresh of our criticality assessment. But we're also going to back it up with a foresight report, which the Joint Research Centre is now producing for us, which is going to map the future demand for the European economy in relation to those specific strategic technologies that we have announced that we want to ramp up. All those things that are linked to the Green Deal and the Repower EU action plan. What we've announced we need to do to achieve our digital goals. I mean, chips is just one of many of those digital things, but also increasingly, if you just look at the real world outside of this policy bubble, there's a war just across the border from the European Union, and we're busy at the moment supplying armaments and all sorts of materials to help repair the Ukrainian economy, and we need to rebuild that stuff, that capacity inside Europe. And who knows, we may need to actually be thinking seriously about defense more than we have for a generation, right? So these things all come together, and we will be looking at how we can really focus through our Critical Raw Materials Act on what we're going to call strategic raw materials, which are the ones that link very much to the policy choices the European Union has decided on, the things that the European Council has told us we need to focus on. Now, there is a trade-off, though. You can't set these assessments in stone, and you need to have a flexibility and an agility to take stock of new situations. And that's where this advisory capacity we want to construct through a board comprising the supply agencies around the European Union working with us will help us. But on the same token, if you change it too often, you lose the investor predictability, and some of these strategic projects will be in danger. I've lost my screen. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, it's fine.
It's all gone black here. Maybe I said
no, it's all perfect.
anyway. I finished.
Okay, thank you very much. I see that we've got plenty of questions from the audience. Before I move on to that, just a final question to Henrike Hahn, because I know you've traveled around, you've been to the US, to other parts of Europe. What does the mine of the future actually look like? Do you have a vision for that?
Yes, of course. You were mentioning my travel to Poland, to a mine there, and as well as to the United States. And I've seen, of course, that the situation of mining is always a lot handled in a very different way sometimes. I mean, there are mining experts really working on accepting the highest environmental and social standards. And then there are also mining facilities who don't care so much about that, to say it that way. So I think, of course, there is a lot of potential we can meet in that regard. And of course, I mentioned that before, we have some possibilities and challenges here, and we have to hide all what we have to spell out in the Critical Raw Materials Act in the future. We have to develop in the best way, and as was just said in the discussion, I think it's very important as a base for our decisions that we have a very concrete, if it's possible, perception of what kind of critical materials we need and in what amount, because this is very important, of course, as a base for the discussion. And if you talk to companies working in that field using raw materials, then they have a very specific calculation of these kind of figures. And I think we as political actors are a little behind always, because we don't have the same amount of data, the same quality of data for these kind of calculations. But it's very, very important, of course, because when we consider as well alternatives or long-term strategies, like including recycling and all the procedures and methods we need to achieve these targets, then we need a realistic calculation. So I think this is very important as well. All the aspects we mentioned already in that discussion for a kind of wish mining site is very important, but also to have a long-term, broader perspective in the future of where we want to go to and how we want to achieve, of course, our climate goals, and to push for the Green Deal at the same time, and to respect all the demands as well at the same time that a competitive green industry in Europe needs. And to figure out and to think of what the future green industry should look like. And then if we put all these pieces and puzzles together, I think we could have a good solution for the future. And I really hope that we will be very concrete in this year. And I think it should be also, this is the responsibility of the European Parliament as well, because the Commission, we have a lot of cloudy suggestions, but which is good, of course, because then we have the potential to be more precise, and it's on us in the Parliament to support very concrete measures and concrete solutions. And this is what I hope we will spell out as well in our work in ITRE on the Critical Raw Materials Act.
Thank you very much. I would like to link two questions we got from our viewers. First of all, there's Manuela Kropp, and she's asking what exactly will be mined in Europe, and more importantly, so well, that's my emphasis, who's going to decide? Will companies decide by themselves, or what will be the role parliaments will play? And Susanna Fitzgerald from the Natural Resource Governance Institute is pointing to the risk of corruption. I think that links in quite nicely with the first point, or the first question. To what extent are you actually taking corruption risks and governance issues in the mining sector into account? And I think that should probably go to Franziska Brandner and Peter and Henrike, if you want to come in.
Yeah, I'm like, if I understood the first question correctly, I'm like, at least in Germany, you can acquire licenses, and then you have to go into a permitting process. So we do not say, this is that company does that. So it's a free country. So those you need investors, and you need licenses, and then you need permitting procedures. And what we've discovered, that, for example, the buying of licenses is not part of investment screening. So that is something that we're slowly discovering, and that was, for example, a big surprise in Mexico. All of us were investing in one company, and then it turns out it's Chinese. So we're also in Germany having similar experiences because we don't have any screening mechanism for that. So that would be something, for the Raw Materials Act, I'm like, that goes into different legislation. But if we say that this is critical for us, is it part of a critical infrastructure? Is it not? It's a debate, but I think, just because they're in Germany doesn't mean that they belong to Germans or Europeans. So that is something that one has to also have in mind.
How did the licensing process actually work? Maybe you could explain it just a tiny bit.
In Germany, we have it, for example, also licenses, like if you don't use them, you can lose them, which I think is an important principle. And that if you abuse them, you can also lose them. So it's an entire, it's been built up over centuries. The Bergbauämter, the administration office is responsible for that. They're among the oldest, the Prussian offices you had. No, seriously, the history of them is quite amazing, quite impressive. They were among the first really state in that terms, structuring markets at the time. And it's interesting to compare that, for example, when it comes to digital licenses, the frequency licenses, we don't have adopted that model that you lose them if you don't use them. That would be amazing, because then we would have no white spots. So, I think sometimes one can really learn from that sector that is centuries old and where they have developed markets that actually do function, that, you cannot possess it and not use it, and etc. So in a way, it's an interesting area where we have not yet a lot of European harmonization. I'm not even sure if we need it. So I don't know how it works in other member states. And then in terms of, what does the state role has to say? I'm like, we're trying to set, or we will set up a raw material fund in Germany, where we will support on the one side feasibility, bankability studies, which are often expensive in a way that, you can invest and then you will find out nothing comes out. And then comes the second part in terms of, funding for the projects themselves. And there, of course, we will make a choice and we will be able to set criteria. And that comes with the criteria we were talking about earlier, like the environment, green energy, etc. And that will be applicable for Germany, the EU, and worldwide. So in that sense, we can then decide who we will support financially. But if there's ones that go just by private funding, even better. And I think the corruption question is a very important one. That's why we have IT, the International Transparency Initiative, and I think that's a process internationally that's still happening in terms of what standards will internationally be set. There's the IRMA standard. There's the Canadian one, which I think is not as good. So I think we really have to set standards and combine them. That you have the transparency, you have the social one, which is sometimes in the transparency one, and you have the environmental one, green energy. And that process is happening also within the G7 these days. Japan is focusing a lot on that. And I think that needs to be part of those discussions, that we don't forget the transparency standard against corruption, because it's a sector that has historically been quite corrupt. So, there's
that's why the question came up in the first place.
No, but I think, we have to make sure that we make it more transparent, and that is part of our endeavors. And then the costs, and there, I think, what you said, Chris Heron, in terms of, will we put customs duties, etc. I'm like, in a way, as you said, it's always a bit more expensive than the imported ones. And the question is, will it be forever state subsidized, or will we create a level playing field that allows our companies to be competitive? And I hope we will find a way that does not force governments to subsidize that for for really many, many years. So we will have to set a legal framework that allows us to be competitive.
Peter Handley, anything you would like to add? Because I think it's very important to address these points. We can see from the questions that there are a lot of worries out there.
Yeah, so as far as the corruption point is concerned, Dr. Brown has already mentioned the EITI initiative. We will be expecting the countries that we partner with to apply this. It's about committing to clean ways of doing business. Have to be aware, however, that the reality in some developing countries is that's been the model that's been used, particularly by countries which are less scrupulous than us in terms of securing resources. Enough said on that. I think we also need to be more vigilant about who gets access to resources. I'll give you a couple of examples. We've been looking at some projects which would be really, really good projects for the European Union to partner with third countries. And just at the moment, we've been expecting them to come to us. We've discovered that, you know, a Chinese company has moved in, taken a strategic investment and bought up the whole of their future production for the next 10 years. Game over, you know. And the problem is that even if that is a European company in charge of the asset or an Australian, nobody has got policy tools in place to prevent that kind of operation. No one has got policy tools to stop a large offtake agreement being negotiated.
None of us. They can be bought like in a heartbeat. We don't even notice. You wake up and you realize, damn, it's Chinese now.
We're catching up with stuff. I'll give you one concrete example we need to keep our eyes on. In Ireland, in County Wicklow, one of the world's largest Chinese battery producers, Ganfeng, is exploring for lithium on a mountainside in County Wicklow. They have an exploration permit. And then will China come in and extract that material and take it away to be processed in China? I'm not sure that's the best use of European resources.
I suspect the question came from Ireland because the name of the lady sounded Irish. So there could even be a link.
That was
Thank you very much. It's time to wrap up. Lots and lots of different points that we weren't able to address in the time frame that was given, but I think we're all very much looking forward to this, and I'll pass the floor to Henrike Hahn, who will certainly like to add to what has been said. And for me, just one takeaway is really we need to move away from this post-colonial attitude to mining in other countries. For me, that's something that's really struck me during the debate. And then at the same time, we see China is adopting maybe a neo-colonial attitude nearly, but that certainly will be counteracted by the Raw Materials Act. Henrike Hahn, I'd like to pass the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciated with all my heart this very fruitful debate. It was very inspiring, and I hope to be in contact with all of you on our work on raw materials in the future as well. And I think we agree that raw materials will be very crucial in the future for us, for our climate goals, and at the same time to make sure that the European industry can compete globally and sustainably to secure millions of jobs in the member states. And I think we can all agree that it's good to focus on sufficiency and circularity, claiming primacy of environmental and societal concerns, and that it's very important, of course, to work with the EU trade partners correspondingly. But I think as well that the Critical Raw Materials Act is a unique chance to be a puzzle of reframing Europe's green industrial policy. So it's a real chance we have at the moment. I'm really looking forward to explore all the possibilities we have to work on that together. And yeah, I say thank you very much for being with us at the screens as well. And dear panelists, I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful evening, and thanks for being with us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.